A black woman was escorted out of a federal courtroom, yet no one knew she once worked in counterintelligence at the Pentagon. When the White House called, it wasn't just justice that changed, but history itself. Dawn had barely broken over Shady Grove's Main Street when the federal courthouse was already teeming with people. A light drizzle settled into the pores of the granite steps, coating each one in a thin, cold film of mist that made every step slick and uncertain. But no one left. Everyone was waiting for the strangest trial of the year, where a former communications officer, fired without fanfare, was daring to take on one of the most powerful consulting empires in the country. Sloane Mercer, 39, entered the courtroom with her natural curls pinned tightly and a dark raincoat draped over her shoulders. She was no longer the Pentagon's top political language analyst, and no longer the director of strategic content at Ascena Strategies, a powerhouse political and corporate communications firm behind dozens of high-level campaigns. Today, she was just a plaintiff, armed with over 300 pages of evidence, alleging discrimination, political manipulation, and gross ethical misconduct. Ascena Strategies operated at the nexus of two worlds. On the surface, it managed PR for Fortune 500 giants. Behind the scenes, it crafted the messaging strategies for high-stakes political campaigns, including those accused of racial bias, voter suppression, and coded language manipulation. Sloane had once written that code, and now she knew how to reverse engineer it. Ms. Mercer, a voice rang out from the defense table, dripping with condescension. "Did you come here to perform political theater or to seek justice?" Sloane didn't respond. She simply placed her leather case on the table and opened it slowly. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, from the jury box to the row of reporters silently scribbling notes, to the court lieutenant whose gaze hadn't left her since she walked in. Judge Evelyn Harlow struck the gavel to begin the session. "Plaintiff, please summarize the basis of your complaint." Sloane's attorney, Derek Brandt, stood. "We allege that Ascena Strategies not only wrongfully terminated Ms. Mercer's employment, but also deliberately attempted to conceal a political disinformation campaign, one in which she was penalized for attempting to expose internal misconduct." At the defense table, Raymond Slade, a silver-haired legal heavyweight known for defending congressional elites, arched a brow. "Your Honor," he said, his tone long-winded and smug, "the plaintiff's so-called evidence is inadmissible. These documents were not only obtained improperly, but may also constitute unauthorized access to networks involving national security." Sloane leaned toward the microphone. "They weren't hacked. They were sent to my internal inbox while I was employed there. I simply archived them." Judge Evelyn Harlow tapped the gavel lightly. "Ms. Mercer, this is not the time for direct rebuttal. All materials will be evaluated through proper legal procedure." But Slade wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we move to suspend this trial immediately and request that the witness be removed from the courtroom until the contents of this material are verified. We have reason to believe Ms. Mercer is in possession of information tied to classified operations." Court Lieutenant Duval stepped forward. "Your Honor, awaiting your directive." Derek Brandt shot to his feet. "Objection! This is a blatant attempt to intimidate the witness before any formal review of evidence. This courtroom is not a place to silence a black woman for daring to speak the truth." Sloane stood, her hand gripping the thick folder. "If these documents are truly that dangerous, maybe that just proves I'm telling the truth." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Harlow furrowed her brow, then replied coldly, "Lieutenant, please escort the plaintiff from the courtroom while the court deliberates the admissibility of the evidence." Duval approached, his hand resting lightly on Sloane's shoulder. "Ma'am, I need you to step outside now." She remained upright, unflinching, and just then, the side door swung open. A court clerk rushed in pale-faced, clutching a sealed envelope. "Your Honor," she said, voice trembling, "there's an urgent call from the Office of National Security. They're requesting an immediate suspension of all proceedings." The entire room froze. Judge Harlow shot to her feet, eyes wide in a rare flash of visible alarm. In the silence that followed, Sloane stood firm, back straight, eyes calm, as if she had predicted this very moment. And this was only the beginning. Lieutenant Duval no longer pulled at her arm. Instead, he leaned in and whispered something in her ear, then gently escorted her from the courtroom. Proceedings are adjourned. We will be in contact. A court officer told Sloane briskly as she was ushered out a side door, away from the reporters already clamoring beyond the courthouse steps. That evening, after nearly 2 hours of classified briefing and undisclosed location, Sloane was released to her modest apartment in Columbia Heights under quiet surveillance. The apartment sat tucked between aging brownstones in Washington, D.C.'s Columbia Heights. Outside, rain drummed steadily against the window panes like war drums warning of a storm on the horizon. Streetlights flickered through the gauzy curtains, casting pale streaks of light that shifted and shivered across the hardwood floor with every gust of wind. Sloane stood silently before the old metal cabinet, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the rusted combination lock. Inside was a small steel box, hidden beneath a weathered coat and a stack of faded brown folders. She sank to the floor, placing the box on her lap, took a deep breath, and clicked the latch. The metallic snap echoed through the room like a whisper from a past that had never truly been buried. Inside the box, a dark blue ID badge lay neatly in place, edged in gold with embossed lettering that read, Sloane Mercer, Strategic Analysis Division, the Pentagon. Beneath her photo, the red seal of the Department of Defense, now slightly smudged by time. She stared at it. For 7 years, she'd carried that badge through countless checkpoints into rooms without names, where language wasn't merely communication, but a weapon. At the Strategic Analysis Division, she had led teams decoding narrative manipulation campaigns, exposing election strategies built on fear and racial bias. She used to be the cleaner of rhetoric. But when she discovered that the very institution she served was using those same techniques against civilians, Sloane hadn't stayed silent. The confidential report she submitted up the chain of command was buried. Weeks later, she was transitioned to a vague communications role at a political consultancy, a center strategies, a strategic soft landing, and eventually ousted with the excuse of a contract violation. From the bottom of the box, she pulled an old envelope. It was a letter from her late father, a veteran, written when she first took the Pentagon job. You don't need a gun to fight for justice, but if you choose to fight with truth, be ready to walk alone. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She glanced around her modest apartment. It wasn't much, but it was the only space that still felt safe. On the desk sat a photo of her and her mother when she was little. Beneath it, a handwritten note. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's walking forward despite it. The rain outside pounded harder, but inside, Sloane's breath was steadying. She returned the badge to the box, but didn't close it. For the first time in months, she wasn't avoiding her past anymore. The storm outside had just begun, but the storm within her was ready to rise. 3 days later, in a small cafe just off Georgia Avenue, Sloane Mercer sat in the back corner, her dark coat draped over her shoulders, hood pulled low. In front of her, a battered laptop hummed softly, its dim screen lit with rows of encrypted folders. Though those who once tried to silence her assumed she had retreated, the truth was she had never stopped fighting. Only now, it wasn't just about getting her job back. It was about dismantling an entire national network of political manipulation. Inside a folder labeled Blackhawk/Phase 04 were files she compiled over months. Voter data maps sorted by race, tailored media campaigns engineered to exploit racial biases, and most damning of all, emails between the Center Strategies, the nation's most powerful political consultancy, and several offices of sitting U.S. senators. One email leapt off the screen. We need to suppress minority turnout in Prince George's County. Activate urban fatigue messaging package. Channels, micro-targeted ads. Platforms 3 and 4. Avoid native vernacular. The signature read Richard Kessler, currently CEO of Ascena Strategies, former Chief of Government Strategic Analysis, and Policy Media Advisor to Senator Vaughn Clay. More disturbingly, it was Richard who had orchestrated Sloane's transfer from the Pentagon to Ascena under the guise of internal restructuring. He thought she would stay silent. He was wrong. Sloane had once analyzed the very language used in operations like this. She knew how these campaigns were crafted, deployed, and most importantly, how to trace them back to their architects. She clicked open an audio file, a recording from over a year ago, taken at a Senate's headquarters. Sloane knows too much. A man's voice said, "If she talks, we lose the entire Southern candidate group. I want her out immediately. Use the NDA clause as grounds." The soft clink of a porcelain coffee cup landing on a saucer snapped Sloane back to present. The server smiled politely as he topped off her cup. She nodded in thanks, her eyes still locked on the screen. She knew what she held wasn't just evidence of wrongful termination. It was a missing piece in a conspiracy designed to influence a federal election. What complicated matters further was that Sloane remained bound by top-level security clearances from her time at the Department of Defense. If she went public, she wouldn't just risk a lawsuit. She could face federal prosecution for releasing classified information. But if she stayed silent, millions of voters would continue to be manipulated in the shadows. The lawsuit she filed on grounds of discrimination and contract violation was only the surface. The truth ran far deeper, and she needed one precise, well-timed strike, powerful enough that the system wouldn't have time to spin it. Sloane shut her laptop, slipped a tiny USB drive into the chain around her neck, and left the cafe. Outside, the first winds of October swept down the old brick streets, carried with them the tense, electric air of election season, and the quiet signs of a battle about to ignite. Wind slammed against the window pane of her third-floor apartment in Columbia Heights as Sloane Mercer stared into her laptop screen. She had just finished decrypting a hard drive sent to her by a confidential source, Marcus Bell, 3 days earlier. Inside was a mapped internal network of Ascena strategies, along with a trove of emails using racially coded keywords. Concrete evidence that the company had actively coordinated campaigns to scrub the image of black communities from local political messaging. But tonight, the phone rang in the middle of the storm. "Ms. Mercer?" A woman's voice came through the line, urgent and unfamiliar. "I'm a nurse on duty at MedStar Medical Center. A man named Marcus Bell was just brought in. Car accident. He asked us to call you before slipping into a coma." Sloane's body went rigid. She bolted out of the apartment on instinct, driving fast through rain-slick streets that blurred like watercolor in motion. Her heartbeat pounded like war drums in her chest. When she arrived at the ICU, she froze at the glass door. Marcus, his face barely recognizable, oxygen tubes running like tangled wires, was unconscious, motionless. A doctor shook his head. Survival alone is a miracle. Sloane stood there for what felt like hours, her eyes locked on the heart monitor, but her mind raced. The crash wasn't random. Marcus was former military cyber intelligence. He didn't just lose control. And one fact chilled her to the bone. The USB drive he always wore around his neck was never recovered from the scene. Near midnight, she returned home, only to find her apartment door ajar. Her fingers tightened around a canister of pepper spray as she moved cautiously inside. The living room was dark, but on her desk sat a burner phone, one she didn't own, buzzing softly. Its screen glowed with a message. "Do not upload the data. You're being watched." No sender, no call history, just a cold, digital whisper warning. And then, something even more unexpected. That very night, an encrypted message landed in her private email from an untraceable address. Marcus wasn't the only one with a copy. Attached was a compressed video file. She opened it with trembling hands. Grainy hidden camera footage appeared on screen. An internal meeting at Ascena Strategies. Around the table, senior executives, media officers, and, shockingly, one man in a gray suit with a federal badge clipped to his lapel. Sloane froze. Senator Vaughn Clay, her former direct supervisor at the Department of Defense. The man she had once reported for racially coded language used in domestic counterterrorism briefings, after which she'd been promptly reassigned. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a network of power, propaganda, and engineered silence. Sloane shut the screen. She sat in the dark, fingers resting on her old DoD badge. Department of Defense, Strategic Communications Division. Memories flooded in like a broken dam. There was no one left behind her now. But this time, she wouldn't turn back. Washington, D.C., dusk, The misty rain streaked the windshield like smeared ink on a crumpled newspaper. Sloane Mercer sat still inside her parked SUV outside a discreet cafe on 14th Street. The message had come from a block number. 6 p.m. Café Marlowe. Come alone. No recordings. No weapons. She knew exactly who wanted to meet. In the days since the sudden death of Marcus Bell, the cybersecurity expert who had held the encryption keys to critical evidence, Sloane had been under a quiet siege. Marcus hadn't just crashed, despite what the official police report claimed. She'd spent too long in political psych ops to miss a cleanup hit when she saw one. And ever since that call interrupted the federal courtroom, she knew it hadn't come to protect her. It had come from the top, from someone who wanted her contained. A soft chime jingled as the cafe door opened. In the far corner, a man was already waiting, gray suit, no tie, salt and pepper hair clipped close. Under the muted yellow light, he looked like any corporate executive waiting for a handshake, but Sloane recognized him instantly. Miles Henley, National Security Advisor, a man who'd briefed 3 presidents. "You're right on time," Henley said, his voice low and cold as steel. "I don't have time for cat-and-mouse games," Sloane replied, pulling out the chair and sitting across from him. She didn't ask how he found her or why this particular cafe. Questions like that only gave up ground. Henley tilted his head, squinting. "You think you're fighting for justice, but this is a power board, Ms. Mercer. You believe your little lawsuit is going to bring change? You're threatening people who've safeguarded national security for decades." Sloane braced both hands on the table, her eyes locked on his. If national security means manipulating and erasing minority voices to score political wins, then it's not security, it's tyranny. Henley gave a half smile, almost pitying. He slid a slim envelope across the table. Inside is a non-prosecution agreement, a 6-figure settlement, and a teaching post at a small college in Vermont. A quiet life, no more headlines, and no more accidents. Sloane touched the bird-shaped pendant around her neck, her last keepsake from her mother. Then, slowly, she slid the envelope back. "I didn't come here to be bought into silence. I came here to break it." Henley said nothing. He stood, pulled on his coat, and walked away. But before reaching the door, he turned and looked back. "You think one call from the White House was a victory? That was just a controlled move. We let you stand. Because we still control the board. Not because you're right." Sloane stared after him, her chest as cold as the rain outside. But she didn't flinch. Not anymore. She had crossed the line. And not even the White House could rewind what had just begun. Monday morning broke quietly in Washington, D.C., but inside a modest newsroom tucked in Brooklyn, tension crackled like static. Eyes scanned glowing computer screens as file after file loaded, classified documents, email captures, policy memos, each timestamped and signed by some of the most powerful figures in national politics. At the top of the page, Operation Greygate, Linguistic Manipulation, and Racial Voter Targeting Report. Across town, in a cafe across from Union Station, Sloane Mercer sat in the back corner, beanie pulled low, sunglasses on, quietly watching from afar. On her laptop screen, an incognito tab displayed a secure message. "We are verifying. Going live with the 9 a.m. bulletin." She rested her fingers on the compass pendant at her neck, a gift from her mother when she got her first assignment at the Department of Defense. "If you stay your course, you'll never be lost," her mother once said. This morning, Sloane knew she was on course, even if there was no way back. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the first phones rang inside national newsrooms. By 9:05, the hashtag eraser now, once weaponized by political smear machines, was obliterated by a digital tidal wave. Hashtag listen to Mercer. The media firestorm had officially begun. Breaking news alerts flooded the airwaves. Former Pentagon language analyst exposes racially targeted voter manipulation campaign. Within minutes, Sloane Mercer went from being labeled a disruptive plaintiff to a nationally recognized whistleblower. Reporters from the Sentinel, ProPublica, and Wired newsroom rushed to contact her legal team. A leaked audio clip, in which a political strategist admitted the need to tailor messaging to avoid undesirable color tones in the test voter pool, instantly became the most discussed topic on Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit. But attention came with danger. Less than 2 hours later, a rock was thrown through her apartment window. A black SUV appeared outside her Columbia Heights apartment. No plates, no driver emerged, but its message was loud and clear. She called her attorney, Derek Brandt. "I think the game's only just begun," she said. "I think we just flipped the board," he replied. "The evidence is in the headlines now. They can't silence you anymore." Sloane knew he was right, but she also knew something else. The war on media doesn't guarantee safety. The forces she was up against didn't just have wealth and influence. They had the power to make people disappear. She lifted her chin and drew a deep breath. If she was in the light now, she wasn't going to flinch. Last night, they tried to drag her out of a courtroom. Today, she'd pulled an entire nation into the fight. The Washington, D.C. night sky cracked open with a deep, rolling thunder as Sloane Mercer stepped out of the Herald Republic newsroom, which had just published an explosive expose based on her classified documents. Neon signs reflected off the rain-soaked sidewalk, but she didn't feel the cold, only a strange, unnatural stillness. Too quiet. She was heading toward her Dodge Charger when a black SUV silently eased to the curb across the street. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a face so familiar her heart skipped a beat. A deep, gravelly voice laced with sarcasm cut through the night. "Still walking like it's Condu's Mercer." Sloane froze. A chill seeped through her coat, but it wasn't the weather. It was memory. During her time in Afghanistan, Sloane had been seconded to Joint Civil-Military Operations, serving as a strategic communications advisor working alongside PSYOPs teams. In a 2010 mission in Kunduz, she had been trapped at a forward base under fire, where she'd saved the life of a fellow operative, Jason Beckett. And that voice, it was his. She turned sharply, eyes narrowing like blades. "I thought you got caught in the blast. Everyone thought you were dead." Jason stepped out of the SUV, his dark hair slick with rain, the black suit clinging to him like an official disguise. A badge without insignia hung loosely around his neck, and beneath the jacket, the familiar outline of the Glock was unmistakable. "Yeah, I thought so too, until the government called and told me there was a personal matter that needed handling." "Let me guess." Sloane narrowed her eyes. "That matter is shutting me up?" "Not shutting you up," Jason replied evenly. "Convincing. They don't want you turning this into a national security crisis. There are a lot of people, important people, behind the campaigns you just exposed." Sloane took a slow step forward, her hand tightening around the phone in her coat pocket. "So they sent you thinking I'd go soft?" Jason held her gaze. "No, they sent me because I owe you my life. And if there's anyone you might actually listen to, it's me." The moment shattered like glass, literally. A high-pitched whistle cut the air, then crack. The rear window of the SUV exploded. Sloane instinctively dubbed to the side as Jason yanked her down. He fired back, shouting, "Sniper!" Third floor, right side. The quiet streets of Columbia Heights erupted into chaos. Screams echoed as civilians scattered. Sirens blared in the distance. Jason dragged Sloane through a side alley behind a laundromat, adrenaline pumping. "They were tracking me," he panted. "This isn't a warning anymore. It's an order to eliminate." Sloane's voice burned with fury. "Then you have to choose. Either stay their pawn, or stand with me and help expose them." Jason met her gaze for a beat. Then he nodded. "Give me everything you've got. I'm in." And in the flickering red and blue wash of approaching patrol cars, Sloane realized she'd just secured something as vital as evidence, an ally from within the shadows. After days of delays and escalating tension, Sloane's trial finally resumed. That morning, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was packed wall-to-wall with media. Just days earlier, the public still saw this as a wrongful termination case. Now it was a reckoning about racial voter suppression, political consulting firms colluding with government figures, and systemic silencing from the top. Sloane Mercer walked into the courtroom wearing a simple black blazer, no jewelry. In her hand, the decrypted, verified originals of the once classified documents. Her attorney, Derek Brandt, leaned in and whispered, "They'll attack your process, not your truth." He was right. As soon as the hearing began, the government's representative, Special Prosecutor Leo Grisham, rose with a chilling objection. The evidence presented by the plaintiff was not obtained through legal channels. These emails, recordings, and server data from government systems are all in violation of the Federal Information Security Act. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Derek immediately countered. The prosecutor is well aware that all this data was extracted by a whistleblower with internal access, and that it does not violate any ethical standards of the profession. Judge Evelyn Harlow struck her gavel. Order. I will consider the possibility of suspending the admissibility of this evidence unless a direct witness can verify it. Her eyes landed on Sloane, almost daring her to play her strongest card, if she had one. Just then, the courtroom doors swung open. A man in a dark gray suit strode in, his face unreadable, but his eyes full of resolve. He held up his FBI credentials and spoke firmly. "My name is Agent Marcus J. Clark. I'm here to testify." Derek turned to Sloane, his eyes wide. "Is that—" "The system validator," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "The only person with Tier 3 clearance. The mainframe holding the full project backups." Clark stepped up to the witness stand. He detailed how he had received internal directives to optimize voter behavior analysis by racial segment, how the system was engineered to systematically filter out candidates of color from campaign considerations, and how a linguistic coding tool, originally designed by Sloane, was weaponized to serve those efforts. The courtroom air turned thick, almost suffocating. Prosecutor Grisham stood to object, calling the testimony unsubstantiated. But this time, Judge Harlow fixed him with a cold stare. "A federal agent is testifying under oath. I will allow it to continue." But what truly silenced the room was a final part of Clark's statement. "After I told my supervisor I intended to testify, I was warned that what happened to my colleague Marcus Bell in that car accident could happen again, to me." A gasp rose from the audience. Sloane sat frozen, her chest tightened. She wasn't just exposing a political campaign. She was triggering a life-or-death confrontation with people willing to do anything to bury the truth. Judge Evelyn Harlow called a 30-minute recess to review the newly submitted evidence. She said nothing to the prosecution team. She didn't have to, because now, even she understood, this case was no longer about wrongful termination. It was a battle for democracy itself. When court reconvened after the break, the courtroom was packed once again, the air heavy as lead. Harsh ceiling lights bore down on a defense table, where Senate Strategy's attorneys sat visibly shaken. Their composed facades had cracked. Sweat glistened on their brows. Judge Harlow re-entered, her face stone cold. She didn't need to strike the gavel. The silence was absolute. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "this court acknowledges its duty to synthesize and assess the full scope of evidence brought before both the public and the law." She opened a thick file, her eyes slicing through each person in the room like a blade. "This court has reviewed a chain of internal emails containing racially discriminatory language, audio recordings of media strategies deliberately crafted to mislead for political gain, and sworn testimony from a verified agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is no longer a labor dispute. This is the blueprint of a smear campaign on a national scale." At the plaintiff's table, Sloane sat upright, her hand tightly gripping the signature, pen she carried since her days at the Department of Defense. In the back row, her daughter, Ava, quietly clutched a Lucky Charm bracelet once worn by her grandmother during civil rights protests. The judge continued, "A Senate Strategies has overstepped both ethical and legal boundaries. This court will forward all case files to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the National Security Oversight Committee." The defense attorney began to rise, lips parting to object, but one look from Harlow stopped him cold. "As for the plaintiff, Ms. Sloane Mercer, this court recognizes that your termination was a deliberate attempt to silence a witness. Furthermore, you have demonstrated extraordinary courage in voluntarily exposing the truth despite immense personal risk." Silence followed. The judge set down the file, folded her hands, and said, "The court recommends that Ms. Mercer and her daughter be entered into the Federal Witness Protection Program. The survival of a witness cannot be left to the mercy of those in power." Sloane turned to Ava. Their eyes met in complete understanding. There was no need for words. She knew what this meant. She would have to give up her name, her modest apartment in Columbia Heights, and everything familiar. But this time they weren't running. They were being protected because they had chosen to fight. A long silence hung in the air. Derek Brandt, her steadfast legal partner throughout the trial, leaned in. "You understand that once you enter the program, you won't be able to appear publicly. No press interviews. No more speaking out." Sloane turned to Ava. "Are we ready?" Ava nodded, biting her lip. "I don't need social media or a birthday party. I just need you not to give up." That simple sentence landed like a blow to the chest. For everyone in the courtroom, Judge Harlow struck her gavel. This trial is adjourned, but the investigation will continue. No one is above the law, no matter who they are. As Sloane walked out of the courtroom, she didn't look back. One door had closed, but another, larger, more dangerous, had just swung open. 1 year later, the sky over Washington, D.C. hung low and gray, as if echoing the political storms that had swept through the nation. On primetime news, the name of Senate Strategies no longer conjured images of power, but scandal. The once untouchable consulting firm that had shaped the public faces of half the Senate had been formally dissolved. Assets frozen. Government contracts terminated. A new oversight commission had been established, enforcing strict regulations over political consulting activities involving racial data and voter psychology. The civil and criminal trials dragged on, but those at the top were no longer able to manipulate the narrative. Senator Vaughn Clay, once photographed with 3 U.S. presidents, once considered untouchable, resigned quietly, citing health reasons. No farewell speech. No political tears. Just a short email to the Congressional Press Office. "For the greater good, I will step down." Richard Kessler, CEO of Ascena and the architect of its divisive media operations, now faced multiple federal charges: conspiracy to violate election laws, obstruction of justice, and coordinating racially motivated disinformation campaigns. At a closed-door hearing, he no longer wore a $5,000 suit, but a detainee's expression, hands clasped, gaze hollow. The court sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison, not just for his crimes, but as a warning to anyone who believes silence is a tool of control. Yet the name that shook the final press conference of the Department of Justice was not Vaughn Clay or Richard Kessler. It was someone who wasn't even there. Sloane Mercer, or rather, the woman who once bore that name, had disappeared from public life ever since entering witness protection with her daughter. No one knew where she was, or how she lived now, but her legacy remained, undeniable, resounding. In the packed briefing room, just as the DOJ spokesperson prepared to close the Ascena case, one official unexpectedly rose, holding a small USB stick. "Before we officially close the file on Ascena," he said, voice steady, "someone asked to leave a final message." The audio echoed through the speakers. A woman's voice, clear, calm, and unmistakable. "Justice doesn't need a face, only a voice, and I've left mine here. If you're out there still fighting and feeling alone, know this: you are not alone. I am one of you, and I am still here, in the change we made." The room fell completely silent. Those who once called her a troublemaker now had no choice but to listen, and those who had long been pushed aside finally saw themselves represented. TV cameras panned a back wall, where a mural had been completed just hours earlier. It showed the figure of a black woman standing tall, holding a worn microphone. Behind her, a sea of protest banners. And above it all, a bold statement: truth is louder than silence. Truth can be delayed, but it cannot be buried.